I live in a city nestled in a valley, surrounded by smaller towns scattered across the hills and mountains. It's part of our local culture for teenagers and young adults to escape to these remote areas during winter months to drink, smoke, and hang out away from prying eyes. My uncle had recently bought a house in one of these secluded locations, and I decided it was the perfect opportunity to spend a weekend there with 5 of my closest friends. The house was spacious, featuring 2 large bedrooms with 3 beds each and plenty of extra mattresses stored away. We arrived on a Friday evening, excited for our weekend getaway. The isolation was both thrilling and slightly unsettling. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and the winding mountain roads made the place feel completely cut off from civilization. As night fell, we decided to head inside and relax while watching TV. Since the living room hadn't been furnished with sofas yet, we dragged some mattresses from the bedrooms and arranged them on the floor. The atmosphere was cozy and relaxed as we settled in for the evening. One of my friends, Victor, stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, leaving the rest of us sprawled across the mattresses, half watching whatever was playing on the television. Several minutes passed before we heard it, a slow, deliberate knocking at the window directly behind where we were sitting. The sound made everyone freeze for a moment, our conversations trailing off into nervous silence. Then someone laughed and said, "Oh shit, it's just Victor messing with us." We all relaxed, assuming our friend was trying to scare us from outside. But something felt off. Since we were sitting on mattresses close to the ground, our line of sight to the window was limited, making it difficult to see clearly who was standing there. The figure remained motionless, just staring straight at one of the girls in our group with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The silence stretched on uncomfortably long. I decided to get up and check, pushing myself off the mattress and walking toward the window. As I got closer, my blood ran cold. The man standing outside looked remarkably similar to Victor. Same height, similar build, even wore glasses like him. But this person was noticeably older and heavier than my friend. The resemblance was uncanny, yet wrong in a way that made my stomach drop. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "It's not Victor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The room fell dead silent. Everyone's eyes were on me, waiting for my next move, but I felt paralyzed by the stranger's unwavering stare. All I could think to do was ask what he wanted. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally speaking. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "There's a bar nearby, and we need a drummer to play with our band. Are any of your friends a drummer by chance?" The question was so bizarre, so random, that it took me a moment to process. Strangely enough, I actually was a drummer, but every instinct told me to lie. "No," I replied firmly. The man continued staring at us for several more uncomfortable seconds before finally turning and disappearing into the darkness. When Victor returned from his smoke break, we made jokes about the encounter, trying to convince ourselves it was just a weird coincidence. Some of us even suggested it might have been Victor playing an elaborate prank, though deep down we all knew better. The man's presence had felt genuinely threatening in a way that was impossible to fake. Later that evening, most of the group decided to sleep in one bedroom, leaving the second room for me and one of the girls, since they'd noticed us getting close earlier in the night. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Hours later, I was jolted awake by the girl shaking me frantically. She was whispering in horror that she'd heard sounds coming from the kitchen. Despite knowing it was probably the stupidest thing I could do, like the guy who always dies first in horror movies, I told her to lock the bedroom door behind me and went to investigate. As I passed the second bedroom, I considered waking someone else to come with me, but when I saw everyone sleeping peacefully, I heard the sound again, definitely coming from the kitchen window. I moved silently through the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly found and grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer just as the back door began to open. It was the same man from earlier. I knew immediately it wasn't a prank because I'd just seen Victor sleeping soundly with the others. We stood there, staring at each other for what felt like 5 to 10 seconds, but seemed like an eternity. The kitchen was small, so we were uncomfortably close to each other. While still holding the door handle, he made a slow, deliberate movement with his other hand towards something concealed under his shirt. Whether it was a gun or a knife, I couldn't tell, but the threat was clear. I raised the knife I was holding, making sure he could see it clearly. He stopped moving. We both understood the situation had reached a critical point. Any sudden movement from either of us could end badly for both parties. The tension was suffocating. I shook my head slowly and said as calmly as I could manage, "Don't." He stared at me for several more seconds, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Finally, he closed the door and disappeared back into the night. I stood there shaking for several minutes before returning to the bedroom. I told the girl it was nothing and suggested we go back to sleep, but I didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. We left early the next morning, earlier than we'd originally planned. I made sure to ask my uncle and cousins about the incident later. They told me the only person who ever visited the property at night was an old neighbor who sometimes used my uncle's rocking chair to sleep off his drinking when his wife wouldn't let him come home drunk. Every year since then, my friends suggest spending another weekend at the mountain house, but I always find an excuse to avoid it. They never learned what really happened that night, and I intend to keep it that way. Some experiences are better left buried in the past. I had just moved into what seemed like an average, quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a peaceful residential area where people minded their own business, exchanged polite greetings, and went about their daily routines. I'd been living there for a few months, settling into a comfortable routine, when something began that would turn my sense of security upside down. It started with my neighbor, a man I'd never spoken to or even seen during daylight hours. Every single night, without fail, when darkness fell, he would emerge from his house and position himself in his yard, staring directly at my home with an expression that can only be described as deeply unsettling. These weren't casual glances or brief observations. These were intense, unwavering staring sessions that lasted anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, and there was something profoundly wrong about his behavior. He would stand motionless, like a statue, never breaking his gaze from my house. His face showed no expression. Not curiosity, not anger, not confusion, just a blank, empty stare that made my skin crawl every time I noticed him there. I tried various approaches to deal with the situation. The first time I noticed him, I thought maybe he was just enjoying the evening air or looking at something else entirely. But as the pattern continued night after night, it became clear that I was specifically the object of his attention. I attempted staring back at him once, thinking it might shame him into stopping, or at least acknowledging the inappropriateness of his behavior. He didn't budge. He didn't even seem to register that I was staring back. Frustrated and increasingly concerned, I decided to confront the situation directly. I walked over to his house one evening and knocked on his door, intending to have a civilized conversation about his nightly vigils. The house fell completely silent at my knock, an eerie, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. I knocked again, waited, called out a greeting, but received no response whatsoever. When I finally gave up and returned to my own porch, I turned around to find him standing at his window, watching me with that same creepy, expressionless stare. It was as if he'd been there the entire time, silently observing my attempt to make contact. The sight sent chills down my spine. I called the police multiple times about the situation, but they were frustratingly unhelpful. According to them, unless he stepped onto my property or made specific threats, there was nothing they could legally do. Standing in his own yard and looking in my direction, while unsettling, wasn't technically illegal. This response left me feeling helpless and increasingly paranoid about my safety. The behavior escalated in small but significant ways. One night, while taking out my trash, I found him standing at the end of my driveway, blocking my path back to the house. When I said hello and asked what he was doing, he remained completely silent and motionless. The encounter was so unnerving that I felt genuine fear. Something violent was about to happen, so I quickly walked away and went back inside. I called the police multiple times about the situation, but they were frustratingly unhelpful. According to them, unless he stepped onto my property or made specific threats, there was nothing they could legally do. Standing in his own yard and looking in my direction, while unsettling, wasn't technically illegal. This response left me feeling helpless and increasingly paranoid about my safety. The behavior escalated in small but significant ways. One night, while taking out my trash, I found him standing at the end of my driveway, blocking my path back to the house. When I said hello and asked what he was doing, he remained completely silent and motionless. The encounter was so unnerving that I felt genuine fear. Something violent was about to happen, so I quickly walked away and went back inside. I began asking neighbors about him, hoping to learn something that might explain his behavior or give me some leverage to make it stop. The responses were uniformly unhelpful. Nobody seemed to know anything about him. Some claimed they'd never even seen him, which struck me as odd given how prominent his nightly routine had become. Others admitted they'd noticed him but had no information about who he was or why he behaved so strangely. His house showed signs of long-term neglect. There was a car in the front yard that appeared to have been sitting there for years without being moved. I never saw him leave the property, except for his nightly staring sessions. He seemed to exist solely for the purpose of watching my house, which made the situation feel increasingly personal and threatening. The psychological toll was enormous. I was losing sleep, constantly checking windows and doors, and jumping at every small sound. The knowledge that someone was watching my home every single night with unknown intentions created a state of constant anxiety that began affecting every aspect of my life. I couldn't relax in my own home, couldn't enjoy quiet evenings, couldn't feel safe even with all the doors locked. I started researching home security options, looking into floodlights, cameras, and alarm systems. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the one taking expensive defensive measures while the person causing the problem faced no consequences whatsoever. I also began avoiding certain areas of my house where I might be visible from his position, effectively allowing his behavior to control how I lived in my own space. The situation felt like something out of a horror movie, a relentless, unexplained threat that authorities couldn't or wouldn't address. Friends and family offered various theories about mental illness, territorial behavior, or simple eccentricity, but none of their explanations made the nightly staring sessions any less disturbing, or the feeling of being constantly watched any more bearable. As I write this, the behavior continues unchanged. Every night, like clockwork, he emerges and takes his position, staring at my house with that same blank, unsettling expression. It's been months now, and I'm running out of options. The police remain unhelpful, moving isn't financially feasible, and confrontation has proven pointless. I'm trapped in a situation where I'm being psychologically tormented by someone whose motivations remain completely mysterious, and there seems to be no legal recourse available to make it stop. I had been living alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment for about 6 months when my life took a terrifying turn that would leave me questioning my safety and sanity. The apartment complex was typical of the area: 3 floors, generally quiet, with residents who kept to themselves. I had settled into a comfortable routine and felt secure in my new home until the day I came home to find my front door unlocked. I have severe OCD, and part of my rigid daily routine involves checking and double-checking that my door is locked before leaving for work. It's not something I would ever forget or skip. The compulsion is too strong and the routine too ingrained. So when I returned from my shift at around 10 p.m. and found the door unlocked, I knew immediately that something was very wrong. My first instinct was to retrieve the 9mm pistol I kept in a drawer near the front door. I set down the bag of fast food I'd picked up on the way home and fumbled for the light switch, my heart already racing with anticipation of what I might find. When the lights came on, the sight that greeted me was absolutely devastating. My apartment had been completely ransacked. Important documents that I kept carefully organized in my office were scattered across the floor. Social security card, birth certificate, financial papers, all mixed together in chaotic piles. The violation felt deeply personal, as if someone had rifled through the most private aspects of my life. I made my way to my office, weapon in hand, and discovered that all the drawers had been pulled open and searched through. Most disturbing of all, my computer had been turned on and was sitting at the lock screen, as if someone had attempted to access my digital life as well. The systematic nature of the intrusion suggested this wasn't a random burglary. Someone had been specifically looking for something, though I couldn't imagine what. After checking the entire apartment and finding no intruder, I called the police. They arrived quickly and took a report, asking the usual questions about enemies or recent conflicts. I explained that I'm not the type of person to have quarrels with others and couldn't think of anyone who might want to target me. The whole situation left me feeling violated and confused. I spent that night lying in bed with my gun under my pillow, unable to sleep and jumping at every small sound. My naturally paranoid tendencies were in overdrive, and I found myself questioning every shadow and noise. The next day, despite having the day off, I couldn't stay in the apartment. I planned to go hiking with my girlfriend, hoping the outdoor activity might help clear my head. Around 9 a.m., I stopped at the Starbucks next to my apartment complex before heading out. While sitting in the busy drive-through line, I happened to look up and see a man standing across the street, staring directly at me. What made this sighting particularly unnerving was how much this stranger resembled me. He had the same hair color and style, appeared to be roughly the same height and weight, wore glasses like mine, and looked to be about the same age. The resemblance was so striking, it was almost like looking at a slightly altered version of myself. The man stood completely motionless, with no expression on his face, just staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When it was my turn to get my order, I grabbed my coffee quickly, but by the time I finished the transaction and looked back, he had vanished. I spent the day hiking with my girlfriend, trying to push the strange encounters out of my mind. I told her about both the break-in and the man who looked like me, and she joked that perhaps my doppelganger had broken into my apartment. Her lighthearted comment would prove to be more prophetic than either of us realized at the time. When I returned home that evening, I was nervous about what I might find. As I approached the stairs to my upstairs apartment, I heard footsteps coming down from above. This was immediately alarming because I didn't have any upstairs neighbors. The unit above mine was vacant. I stopped and waited to see who would emerge from the stairwell, and to my absolute shock, it was the same man I had seen that morning. The resemblance was even more striking up close. It was like seeing a slightly distorted reflection of myself. He walked quickly with his head down, clearly trying to avoid eye contact or recognition. I shouted at him to stop, but as soon as he heard my voice, he took off running. He leapt over the fence that separated the apartment complex from a large field behind the property and disappeared into the darkness. My heart was pounding as I ran upstairs to check my apartment. Once again, the door was unlocked, but this time what I found inside was far worse than scattered papers. Covering the walls of my living room were photographs of my girlfriend and I from our hiking trip that day. The pictures had clearly been taken from a distance, probably from the tree line next to the trail we had been on. Someone had been following us, photographing us, and then broken into my apartment to display their surveillance. The implications were terrifying. This person had been watching me, following me, and had somehow gained repeated access to my apartment. The photos proved that this wasn't random. I was being specifically targeted by someone who was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to invade my privacy and psychological well-being. I called the police again, and this time they took the situation much more seriously. They searched my apartment thoroughly and expanded their investigation to include the entire complex and the field behind it. In the field, they discovered crucial evidence: a pair of eyeglasses and a wig that matched my hair color and style. The items suggested that my stalker had been deliberately trying to impersonate me, explaining the uncanny resemblance I had noticed. The police opened a formal case and stationed patrol cars outside my apartment complex. They also informed the apartment management about the situation, putting everyone on alert. For several days, officers maintained a visible presence, and I stayed with a coworker until the immediate threat seemed to have passed. It's been nearly a week since the last incident, and while there haven't been any new break-ins or photographs, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. The person who was targeting me clearly had advanced planning skills and was willing to invest significant time and effort in their surveillance. The fact that they were attempting to impersonate me suggests motives that go far beyond simple stalking or burglary. I've since installed additional security measures and am in the process of getting a comprehensive alarm system installed. While the immediate crisis seems to have passed, the psychological impact lingers. The knowledge that someone was so obsessed with me that they were willing to break into my home multiple times, follow me around town, and create an elaborate impersonation has fundamentally changed how safe I feel in the world. The most unsettling aspect of the entire experience is that I still don't know why I was targeted or what this person ultimately wanted from me. The mystery of their identity and motivations continues to haunt me, leaving